So I'm opening the next topic, which is Module 6, Internal Controls and ITGC. So let me just... Okay. Okay. So as an introduction to ITGCs, let's watch this video from EY.
Hello, my name is Neil. I'm a recently retired EY assurance partner. During my 37 years at EY, I was partner in charge on numerous audit engagements, and I also served in the firm's Audit Quality and Regulatory Matters group. With me today is Madeline. Thanks for being with us today. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Neil. Thanks for having me. I'm a manager in our EY Technology Risk Group, specializing in IT general control audits. I help support our public company auditing, and I'm happy to share that with you today.
Great, thanks. Well, today we're going to talk about information technology controls. Specifically, we're going to cover the subject of information technology general controls, which are often referred to as ITGCs. We'll talk about what ITGCs are, why they're important, and to whom they're important. So let's get started. Madeline, would you help us understand what is meant by the term IT general controls?
Sure, Neil. Happy to help. I will start with the definition. IT general controls are controls that apply to the system components, processes, and data for a company's IT environment. These controls have different purposes, including to manage the changes, access, or the operations of the IT environment. These controls are part of a public company's Statement of Internal Controls of their financial reporting, also known as their ICFR opinion. What many people don't realize is that there are IT controls all around us, which companies use to protect the integrity of their data. For example, when you download your bank's phone application, you're required to make a username, which associates your name to your bank account, and a password, which is required to have a certain length of characters and a certain number of special characters. These settings let the bank know the transactions are from your account and they're authorized, and helps make sure that only the transactions you want to occur happen. This is an IT general control because it helps the bank address the risk that someone using the application is not authorized to do so. In the context of a company's financial statements, IT general controls take on another meaning. The banking application example I gave is an IT general control that a company may put in place to make sure their external customers are who they say they are. But companies may also want to make sure they have IT general controls internally to protect the data within the application that supports their business. Let's take, for example, an application that supports the payroll for a company's employees. A company wants to make sure their payroll is correct, both to make sure that they're running the business correctly, but also to make sure that they're paying people the amount that they're supposed to be. This is so that they can have accurate reporting to their regulators. The company would want to put controls around testing changes to the source code or the programming of the system so that an inappropriate change isn't made that would break the functioning of the system. It'd be pretty bad if they changed the system code to say that 2 times 2 equals 60 instead of 4. And so IT general controls around the testing and approval of changes helps prevent these inappropriate changes from occurring. These are called change management controls, which along with controls around granting and removing user access, make up a large part of a company's IT control program.
Madeline, we hear a lot in the news these days about cybersecurity breaches at retailers and other organizations that many of us know and engage with online. Do IT general controls help a company address cybersecurity risk?
Yeah, so cyber security encompasses a large number of different topics, such as threat detection, privacy, incident response, and computer forensics. IT general controls can help an organization prevent a breach from an external party and can help prevent bad actors from accessing data within their systems if a breach does occur. But typically when we're talking about IT general controls, we're referring to the controls an organization has in place to protect the integrity of the processing and accuracy of their data that makes up their financial statement.
Thanks, Madeline. That was very helpful. Now, as it relates to application controls and ITGCs, how are those different?
An application control is something altogether different than an IT general control. While an IT general control is put in place to address the risk to the IT application itself, an application control is a business control that the company has programmed to be performed within the application. For example, an application control within a payroll system might be the application appropriately calculates payroll for hourly employees based on hours worked and hourly pay rate. This application control addresses the risk that total payroll is not correctly recorded. Effective IT general controls support the assumption that the calculation of payroll is done correctly every time.
So, in summary, you could say that IT general controls provide an environment to help a business ensure that their IT applications and programs function correctly, that their data is protected, and that IT systems are kept up and running. Now, let's move on to the second topic for today, and that's why IT general controls are important. So, Madeline, could you help us understand why these controls are so important?
Yes, so expanding a bit more on our example company. Let's say they are a public company, and therefore they have shareholders and regulators for whom they're required to report accurately on their financial statements. The example I gave around the payroll application generates the data that supports the company's total payroll expense for the year. The company wants to ensure that the payroll application processes data accurately, not only so they can rely on the system to pay people the right amount, but so they are reasonably sure that the total payroll expense on their financial statements is accurately reported. In order to do that, the company wants to make sure the application does the processing. Here, the calculation of their payroll, each and every time a payroll transaction occurs. Having effective IT general controls supports their reliance on the application working as they expect each time a transaction happens.
What types of risks exist for a company that has deficient IT general controls?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Neil. And I've had a number of experiences where a company's IT general controls are not working as they expected. And it had broader implications than you might think. There are various degrees of a control not operating as expected. For example, an application might have had inappropriate users within their system, which would mean that their access security ITGCs were not working correctly. But the company was able to show that there were no inappropriate transactions which occurred by those inappropriate users. In that case, the results of the IT general controls not operating did not impact the integrity of the data in the system, and the risk that there was a broader impact on the company's financial statements is pretty low. However, I've also had very different experience with a retail client where they had a significant number of IT general control deficiencies across a broad number of systems. In addition, there was a cybersecurity breach at the client, which the company identified and stopped, but not until after the bad actor was able to gain access to a financial system. When the company looked at the number of control failures in their IT organization and added that to the security breach, which introduced the risk of a bad actor making inappropriate transactions, the company overall was forced to report a material weakness in their IT control environment. A material weakness means that there's a reasonable possibility of material misstatement in the financial statements, and that has to be reported to the public. In this case, those deficient IT controls sent a signal that there might be potential problems with their financials.
Great. So we now have an understanding of what ITGCs are and why they're important. I imagine that these controls are important to various individuals within an organization. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us, Madeline?
Sure. From the example I just gave, clearly members of the company who are responsible for reporting on the financials, the controller, the CFO, the CEO, the audit committee, have a direct interest in ensuring that the data they get out of their financial systems is accurate. Therefore, they have a vested interest in ensuring the IT systems have effective IT general controls to protect the company's reporting on their financial position. Therefore, they have a vested interest in ensuring that the IT systems have effective IT general control to protect the company's overall message about the financial position of the company. Not only do the executives within the business need to take careful consideration of that their IT controls are operating effectively, but so do the individuals within IT who are responsible for the applications. If a company has a bunch of IT general controls to protect the applications, but the individuals within IT who are actually responsible for performing those controls aren't doing them, then there's a disconnect between the business and IT. If the IT organization doesn't understand the downstream financial impact for the performance of those controls, then the company may be putting themselves at risk. From my experience, the companies that do the best at this are the ones that have integrated their business and IT functions to help protect the data together.
Those are some really great points, Madeline. And for us auditors, why do we care about IT general controls, and how can they affect the performance of our audits?
The company's financial auditors should definitely care about whether a company has effectively implemented IT general controls. As companies become more technologically advanced, they're continuing to automate financial functions and rely much more heavily on technology to run their business. As we talked about earlier, if a company has effective IT general controls and relies on automated financial controls for their business processes, then they can place reliance on the fact that each time an automated transaction happens, it will be doing the same thing each time. This allows a financial auditor to take a more efficient testing approach. They can test the control only one time instead of many times throughout the year to conclude the control is working correctly. With fewer samples in these highly automated areas, financial auditors can focus their time instead on higher risk areas with more subjective procedures, and overall give reasonable assurance that the financial statements are complete and accurate.
Thanks, Madeline, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. That was all very helpful.
Our next topic for IT auditing is what we call internal controls, ITGC. So our next discussions after CAADS would be focusing on what we call as controls. But first, we'll start with the internal controls, IT general control. So I believe you have already discussed in one of your auditing theory or auditing and assurance classes the concept of internal control and test of controls. So this topic would focus only on what we call as IT general controls. So we'll be taking a look at what are information technology general controls, which has been already introduced in the short video that we have presented earlier, who performs the ITGCs, the common ITGCs, which is manage access process, manage program and system change process, and manage IT operations process. So what are IT general controls? So IT general controls are procedures and policies implemented by management to safeguard the information system hardware and application from unauthorized access changes. So in a way, sabi niya, there are like locks on your home. If a burglar wants to take something of value from your home, such as your computer, television, works of art, jewelries, money, etc., they would first need to get into your home. And to deter this possibility, homeowners have locks on their doors and windows and even install security devices to alert them if there is a breach. So similarly, ITGC functions as the first line of defense for intentional and even unintentional efforts to gain access to valuable IT functions and data. So well-designed, implemented, and operating IT general controls are essential for an organization's applications to be able to accurately and completely capture, process, store, and report critical management and financial information. Without ITGCs, stakeholders would question the integrity and reliability of financial information. And consequently, ITGCs are as important to the users of the financial statements and those who do business with the company as they are to the company. Because ITGCs protect IT systems, their absence puts the IT infrastructure, programs, and data at risk. Consequently, this increased risk puts in doubt the integrity of the system and reports they generate. So ITGCs are distinct from other controls such as yung application controls, which is part of our Module 6, and IT-dependent manual controls, which are just regular control that are or is part of the IT system. And of course, purely manual controls, of which there are few. So ITGCs are agnostic with respect to particular software application. So hindi siya specific na for SAP in particular, but it should apply to all or the whole department or business. It is also not agnostic also with respect to the business department because their focus is on the overall IT environment, not a specific business department, software application, and related data. Consequently, for any program change, the ITGC will require proper approval by the requesting business department, as well as some level of acceptance testing by the department. Regarding any access to programs or data, a properly authorized list of individuals with their level of access is required by the ITGC. Before access is added, changed, or revoked. The purpose of the ITGC is to provide a controlled environment over all affected software program changes and implementations and data access changes and updates, including having processes in place to ensure that all such programs are kept in operation, which includes being backed up timely. So ITGC's ITDMs are those in which effectiveness of particular control relies on IT-generated data used to perform analysis and control. This means that the both ITGC and application-specific controls need to be effective and the related data adequately secured for the ITDM to achieve its control purpose. So for example, an entity establishes its allowance for bad debts using data analysis of past debt patterns in terms of aging of receivables, as well as customer credit score and other related information. So a program was created to download the relevant customer historical data to group it into various analysis categories, and from that, apply historic loss percentages to estimate the current loss reserve estimate. So if the ITGCs did not function correctly, resulting in an application that has calculation and other errors, it is likely that the data extracted is meaningfully incomplete or otherwise inaccurate, and the application to accumulate and analyze the data did not function as intended, resulting in incorrect results upon which the allowance for bad debts is based and evaluated. So just a note that manual controls by definition does not rely on IT functions, and accordingly, they are not part of this discussion. So very important yung ITGC because especially programs and computers uh, function in one way or process all the things in the same way as it is programmed. So let's take a look at the example. So Jennifer, a sales manager, has programming skills. So Jennifer is a valuable employee, but feels she is underpaid. She knows that the program that produces her monthly paycheck is stored on a server that is only accessible from a dedicated computer terminal located within the data center. So each month before the payroll program is run, Jennifer stays late and enters the data center to modify the program to increase her pay by $1 per hour. After the payroll program has generated the monthly pay, Jennifer goes to work early and changes her pay rate back to the original amount. So here, if Jennifer's company had good ITGCs, neither Jennifer nor any other unauthorized individual will be allowed to access or to enter the data center. So physical access and ITGCs would restrict access, for example, the logical access to any program used by company only to authorized users. So yung physical access, ibig sabihin meron siguro keycard, merong susi, may guards, may log, kung sinong pumunta sa data center. And then the ITGC's restriction logical access, there is proper username and passwords that is used to modify the sales program. So usually, ITGCs is a joint effort by the IT department and the business department to accomplish. So for example, why it's typically the role of IT to accurately and timely implement new and change data access for employees, it is the requesting business department's responsibility to ensure that the list of such access provided to the IT department is accurate and duly authorized. So without both the IT and business departments properly performing their duties, the controls over access will not be achieved. Similarly, for changes to software applications, it is typically a combination of IT and business department personnel who perform acceptance testing to ensure that the requested change function functions as intended. So we have the common ITGCs, managed access process, which includes data center physical access and security controls, and logical access controls over application, data, and supporting infrastructure. Manage program and system change process, including program change management controls and system development lifecycle, including acquisition, change, and maintenance. And manage IT operations process, computer operation and maintenance controls, and backup and recovery controls. So the ITGC strategy is developed to directly address the major risks impacting key financial accounts. So ITGCs are controls that apply to systems component, processes, and data for a given organization or IT environment. ITGCs are an integral part of the internal controls of the overall business operations and financial information. They are essential for the reliance on and reliability of data, reports, automated controls, and other system functionality underlying the business processes. So ITGCs are the overall controls, which are part of entity-level controls of the COSO framework. So application controls relate to specific IT program or application, and they are part of the company's control activities. So just to introduce, the application controls, unlike ITGCs, are automated actions of the entity's IT applications that occur without manual intervention and relate to procedures used to process transactions or other financial data. They are designed to prevent or detect errors in processing a transaction. So application controls help verify that all transactions occur, are authorized, and are completely and accurately recorded and processed. For example, we have edit checks, validations, calculations, interfaces, and authorization. We will be discussing that later on in the next module. So what is the difference of ITGC versus application control? So in the video, the example was banking on your smartphone. So ITGCs are involved and include manage operation ITGC. You have a physically operable smartphone. The phone is charged and not damaged and in your possession. So manage access, both smartphone and banking app require authentication, ID, password, Face ID, fingerprint, passcode. So manage change ITGC, smartphone operating system software and application software are kept up to date. So without this ITGC's functioning, you likely can't bank online. So the application controls naman, once you are signed in to your banking app, the application controls come into play. These controls process your transactions and include, for example, when making a transfer between your accounts, the app controls may limit the amounts that can be transferred. So this also may ask you to confirm or cancel the transaction prior to execution. So ITGCs are general controls to protect the security, integrity, and reliability of financial information, while application controls are specific controls to prevent or detect correct problems in processing a single transaction or groups of similar transactions. Application controls rely on effective ITGC. So for example, if there are effective ITGC, sometimes we test less of the application controls. So in the COSA framework, ITGC is in the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. Okay. So we have a three process, or technically, these are the three ITGC process and three major classes of ITGC. So sa managed access process, the ITGC is the managed access. And then managed program and system change process. For ITGC, there would be managed program and system change and managed IT operations. So these three are the broad classes of ITGCs that are available or that should be present within a company or the IT environment of the company. Okay, so first process we have the managed access process. The objective of this process is to provide access to the IT environment. So this ensures only authorized and appropriate users have access to the IT environment. So those users are restricted to performing authorized and appropriate action. So for example, we have SAP. I know you're all familiar with. So yung so within the sales module or the orders, only a certain user would have access to this module. And then approvals will be assigned to a user number or another user. So in the managed access process, what can go wrong? So what are the risks within this process? So this includes authentication and security settings. So typical risk is that users of the environment are not intended users due to inadequate authentication and security setting. Additional risk would be yung unauthorized user gaining authentication and security. So for ITGCs or the expected ITGCs in the managed access process would include password settings are appropriate for the environment and level of risk. So this is applicable in all environments. So for example, we have our password password policies. So yung halimbawa, kailangan in characters, kailangan 10 characters, kailangan it includes capital letters, small letters, symbols, numbers, certain length. Then you have to change every 3 months. You have to change every 30 days. You cannot use any password that you have used for the last five. Change passwords, things like this. Okay. So key security settings other than passwords are appropriate for the environment and level of risks. For example, so the use of token devices as main user authentication. So there should be appropriate controls over the issuance and authentication procedures when the server is out of sync with the token. So meron tayong tinatawag na mga tokens. So meron tayong hardware-based and software-based. So makita natin yung token usually is just para siyang maliit na keychain with na small numbers, hindi key, parang key fob lang siya or keychain. And then, the software base, usually we have uh, applications. For example, yung mga Google Authenticator. So, yung second factor or sa two-factor authentication, usually, you can use the software if you do not have the hardware-based token. So the permission of Windows-based application when access to IT application is linked to a login of a Windows-based device. So mayroon din tayong tinatawag na single sign single sign-on. So yung single sign-on, generally it's a better security because you just need to remember one password, so you will have access to all the IT environment. So for example, in FEU, we have a single sign-on to your email, and then you will also have access to the different facilities. Halimbawa, sa so yung sa Canvas, nandiyan yung access. So yung sa office or sa email, and then ano pa ba? Sa NetSuite, you can also have access to that password. So isa lang, yung tinatandaan mo, you already have access to everything. And from the IT admin perspective, so let's say nawala mo yung password mo or you think you have been hacked, they can immediately remedy it. Parang it will be easier because there's only one password to turn off or one user account that has to be turned off or discontinued. Okay, so this is applicable in IT environments when security settings at the IT application, database, or operating system level have a high risk of permitting unauthorized users to access IT environment components that are important for the audit. So also remember that there are multiple components to a single software. So for example, ang nakikita natin sa Canvas na software, that is the application layer, tinatawag natin, and application layer or the front end application. So yung users mo, you manage at that level. Okay. So Canvas runs in the cloud. So meron tayong another operating system, tinatawag natin OS level, where that application is situated. So yung OS na yon, uh, where that application is installed. There's also user access or user settings. Also, of course, meron tayong tinatawag na database or yung DB level. So, kung saan nakastore yung mga data within Canvas. So, application layer, meron siyang database level. So, sa DB level, meron din tayong different user access. So, imagine if you have a complex IT environment or the bigger your company, the more complex the industry, you can only imagine yung mga, let's say, telecommunications company, how many applications they have. So, in one of the telecommunications company that I know, they have at least parang 200 software, and then sa isang bank or global banking company that I know, they have more than 3,000 applications and components to their IT environment. So imagine how critical ITGC or the management of users would have to be in those situations. Okay. So other ITGCs is that default passwords of systems delivered ITs that affect key security settings have been changed or related accounts has been disabled. So this is applicable to most IT applications, database management systems, and OS. So yung default password natin, usually, yung first time sign in mo, especially if you created, I know you probably experienced this when you created your first Gmail account or a Gmail account that has been issued to you or an email account issued to you, a new application issued to you, you have the default password. The first time you sign in, it will ask for you to change your password. So that is one internal control because usually the default password is really known by other people or by other personnel. So halimbawa, classmate mo, alam din niya kung ano yung default password. So if you are given new accounts, the first thing you should do is as soon as possible, log in and change the default password. And then passwords and other key security settings are verified quarterly to appropriate settings defined by policy. So this is applicable in IT environments needing strong security. Okay? So usually yung mga admin accounts na tinatawag natin privilege, ang spelling ata, privilege access accounts. So they usually go monthly, quarterly, independent access monitoring. So this area including access rights. So users of the IT environment, IT and business are not authorized or the access granted does not match what was approved. So okay. So new or additional access rights are approved by an appropriate management person in advance of the access being granted. So changes are approved by management prior to the move into production based on vendor supplied release notes. So this is more likely a risk in which changes are vendor supplied and are not in response to specific changes or change requests of the entity. Changes are approved by the business and IT management after testing prior to the move into production. So, for example, sometimes when testers, change test the system or the application prior to deployment into production, sometimes their user accounts might be left in the production system. So nung nag-move na into production, the application, the tester access might be left in there. So that should also be reviewed. So next, users of the IT environment are not appropriate. So mga nag-resign na, mga lumipat ng office, lumipat ng tasks, lumipat ng department, they should be readily updated. So access rights are verified periodically by appropriate management personnel. Access rights no longer needed by users who are leaving the entity. So ito nga yung resignations or retirement. Who have changed job responsibilities are ended timely based on notification from HR or the user supervisor or manager. So the access rights of inactive users are removed or disabled. And another risk area, the access of IT users of the IT environment creates a SOD concern. So this is applicable to IT environments with segmentation of duties concerns, either with the entity's IT personnel or with the users of the IT application. So activity logs of people with access that created SOD concerns are reviewed by knowledgeable people who do not have such access or the changes are matched to approvals. The settings that produce the logs may not be changed by the people whose access is being monitored, or such changes create notifications to others and the notifications cannot be stopped by the people whose access is being monitored. So access to functions within the IT application is combined into roles. The access rights within the roles contain SOD issues that could cause a material misstatement to the financial statements. So applicable to IT applications in which access rights are aggregated into roles. So for example, yung mga rights, let's say it's segregated to roles. So sales associate, so sales manager roles. So there should be a defined process to change the access rights within roles that includes approval by appropriate business management. And the transaction access included in the rules is reviewed for appropriateness at least annually. So typical risk direct data changes are made without authorization. So this is applicable to IT environments in which there is routine use of direct data changes in the processing of transactions relevant to the financial statement. So direct data changes should follow a process that includes approval by an appropriate person other than the requester and the pre-implementation testing or post-implementation verification of the accuracy of the change. And changes to the data made by users other than the IT application or IT application users are logged and compared with the requests and approvals for those changes by people without access to make such changes. Next, manage program and system change process. So the objective is that new IT application programs or changes made to existing IT application programs are appropriate and then they function as intended by the management. So pag may updates, may changes, retirement, they should all go to what we call a change process. So application programs include reports generated by IT application, for example, an aging of accounts receivable by customer, interfaces between IT application, for example, the program that moves detailed sales and cash receipts information to the general ledger, and configurations of IT applications, for example, setting choices of accounts receivable aging categories. So what can go wrong and what are the risks? So typical risk, new IT application programs or changes to existing programs, including reports, configurations, or interfaces do not function as described or requested because they are not adequately tested by appropriate people. So there should be changes or changes to the IT application should be tested. So yun yung tawag natin UAT, User Acceptance Testing. Meron pa tayong systems integration testing. So if there are different modules, so that the system or that update should be evaluated together as part of the system. And then, as appropriate, prior to the move into the production. Also, changes are validated immediately after installation. So kung may errors pa or may mali, it can be resolved readily. So this applies when an entity uses simple, unmodified vendor-supplied software and lacks a test environment wherein programs are tested before they are allowed to be used with actual company data or changes or configuration changes such as changing categories on accounts receivable change report. Next, new risk or new IT application programs or changes to the production IT application programs, including reports and interfaces, are not appropriate to business or IT environment. ITGCs, changes that affect the IT application are approved by the business management personnel who are not the requestor prior to the move into the production. This is less likely a risk wherein changes are vendor supplied and they are not in response to specific change requests from the entity. So for example, yung SAP, kung nag-issue ng update, so changes are approved by management prior to the move into production based on vendor-supplied release notes. And changes are approved by business and IT management after testing and prior to the move to the production. So programs in production are not secured, permitting developers to move unauthorized or untested changes into the production environment. So in this situation, usually a key segregation of duties is that the developers are separate from those who can. Natawag natin change managers. So the change managers are the only ones who can move from testing environment to the production environment. So yung developers, hindi nila ma-access yung production environment. Diretso lang sila. When it's ready, after approval, the change managers would get the software from the testing environment and move it towards the production. So usually yung access Diba, we have discussed yung privilege access. So yung privileged access, usually there's another department having all those user accounts. And when you need certain privileged access, you will need to request from them. So usually that's what we call privileged access management or PAC. Pag nag-request kayo sa kanila, saka siya lamang generate na bagong admin password. And that admin password will the only be password to be used for the production environment. And then merong certain ano lang siya, certain time frame. So kung halimbawa mag-update sila this weekend lang yung access rights. When the time passes, hindi na nila ma-access yung production with the access credentials that they have. They will need to request again from PAM for the privilege access rights. Okay, changes the same. Okay, next configuration changes. Okay, so key configurations or key settings made by the IT personnel are inappropriate or unauthorized. So changes to key configurations are logged, and logged is reviewed by knowledgeable people who cannot change the configurations being monitored. So changes to key configuration are logged, and changes on the log are matched to the authorizations for changes by someone who cannot change the configurations that are being monitored. So key configurations are verified quarterly. So ano ba yung configurations? So before we get confused, so for example, we have the cash register sa McDo, for example. So the cash register, usually, if there is a substantial change or update into the software, that would go to the change process. That's a given. However, there are some configuration, for example, yung price table. So of course, the price table, you cannot input it by uh, manually. And of course, the price table cannot be, let's say, subjected to what we call the change process because ite-test mo pa ba yung price table, etc., etc. So usually, this is just a change of configuration. So this key configuration, while it's simpler, the configuration still has to be uh, approved by the business, and those changes are usually locked on to a certain user. So for example, yung IT personnel lang in charge can modify the price table, and uh, it cannot change any item in the price table without prior approval. Also, the changes or key configurations are verified quarterly. Or minsan new products. Kaya mapapansin nyo, hindi rin laging always nagkakaroon ng new products. Usually, it follows a seasonal or monthly or quarterly basis. Next, multiple instances of the same IT application that should be identical are not the same. So changes are pushed to all instances at the same time, and program information from various instances is compared periodically to identify differences. So ano yung multiple instances? Kasi usually, so yung systems usually, if there are too many people accessing at the same time, so it will cause the system to crash because there's too many people accessing at the same time. So one of the solution is to create multiple instances. And with those multiple instances, of course, one of the things that we have to ensure is that all the version of the system is the same across multiple instances. So usually yan, may tatlong front end but a single database. So the same data is fed through the system, but the system can now breathe better. So usually meron tayo tinatawag na load balancer. So once na mag-try yung isang user, tapos let's say 300 people na yung nasa system 1, it will try to balance out and move other people to the other system. So hindi magka-crash yung system, it will be able to use without problems, but still the data is the same. So dapat the multiple instances nitong systems should be the same. So there would be no differences in the experience or the data and features present. Because baka mamaya hindi updated, let's say itong system 2, it will cause an error within the database and users may not be able to access this particular instance. Okay. Lastly, our last group is the managed IT operations process. So the objective is to provide a reliable IT processing environment. So basically, we have the first one, manage user, manage access. So dealing with the user access. So we have manage change, dealing with changes within systems or within the IT environment. So your managed IT operations would deal with everything else. So what are the typical risks in the IT operation process? So for example, hardware and software issues result in the loss of data. So data is written in real time to servers in a physical location separate from the production environment. So meron tayong backup. So for example, meron kang business sa Makati, ang head office mo, meron kang live data backup sa, let's say, Quezon City, backup. So halimbawa, lumipol sa Makati, you have your data saved in Quezon City. And of course, not only data is backed up, syempre yung applications natin should also be backed up. So IT personnel monitor the execution of job schedule and take actions appropriate for issues that arise. So usually backup is done using a job schedule. So we should always check that the job schedule has run properly. Okay, I think that's all for the change access or the introduction for or the basics for ITGCs. We continue on our discussion with internal controls ITGC. Now we are on part 3, evaluating ITGCs. So this module will provide an overview of the information technology general controls testing. So while the principles apply to a financial statement audit, so this module is not focused on the FS auditing, but is focused on evaluating ITGCs from an organization perspective. So the outline is what are the objectives in ITGC, or what are the ITGC objectives, gaining an understanding of the IT processes, identifying the risks within the processes, identifying and testing ITGCs, and what are the implications for management. Okay, so ITGC has three main objectives. You can see confidentiality, which protects information from being accessed or viewed by unauthorized users. Integrity protects the integrity of hardware, software, and data. And availability verifies that the data, hardware, and software are available when needed. And so the objectives are accomplished with controls over. So yung confidentiality and integrity is accomplished with the controls over manage, access, or MA. And then availability and integrity with MC or manage changes. While confidentiality and availability is with operations or MIOT pala, IT operations. So ITGC encompasses the following components of the company's IT system. So IT architecture, IT components. Of course, let's not forget the people as a crucial component and sometimes the weakest link in the IT system, processes, and an evaluation of the overall control environment. So ITGCs, just to take a look back again to refresh our memories, ITGCs are general controls because the concepts apply to all the IT components of the businesses. So ITGCs are general internal controls that strengthen the specific internal controls. So it has purview these three main classes of ITGCs over automated controls, whether with or without manual component. So mga IT application control and IT dependent manual control, applications, operating system, databases and storage, and networks and interfaces. So testing ITGC will require technical skills and proficiency with the following IT functions. So we need to have the knowledge to understand what are automated controls, what are the specific application and programs, the operating systems, data and storage and databases, and networks and interfaces. So what is the purpose? Why do we need to test ITGC? So it's the same way that we test or test of control in order to support our audit opinion and to decide the extent of our substantive procedures. Since ITGC or IT general controls are basically one of the controls of the company, we will need to be testing this. So ITGC testing is developed to directly address the major risks impacting key financial accounts and management reports. So ITGCs are controls that apply to all of an organization's system components, processes, data, and the IT environment. So since ITGC are integral part of the internal controls of the overall business operations and financial information, they are essential for reliance on and the reliability of data, reports, automated controls, and other system functionality underlying the business process. So what is our approach in testing ITGC? Here are some of the steps that we need to follow in order to test ITGC. First, we gain an understanding of the IT processes. So this is done in order to develop, of course, an understanding and to know which items are relevant, especially for financial reporting in the case of financial reporting or financial statements audit. Next, identifying risks within the processes. So identifying and testing ITGCs that address the risks in the areas of IT access, changes, and operations. And then performing a walkthrough to verify the understanding of ITGC procedures and risk. So to do this, we might do simulation or pre-performance. And testing ITGC that address the risks in the areas of IT access, changes, and operations. So let's look at the steps one by one. So gaining an understanding of the IT processes starts with first understanding the classes of transactions that are grouped together and that are significant to the financial statement or internal management report. For example, sales, revenue and accounts receivable, purchases, and production variance reports. So understanding where, when, and how transaction that total reports are. So when is it initiated or how is it initiated? What are the authorized or authorization procedures? What are the processes? What and how are recorded? And what are the reports? And what are the contents of these reports? So all processes are subject to ITGCs. So ITGC should operate at the process level and are normally independent of a particular process. So for example, management's policy for granting employee access rights will be the same for all processes, but it will be applied to a specific process such as access to investing application in the financing cycle or protecting the budgeting application from unauthorized changes. Okay, so the ITGCs from specific processes are part of the different cycles which is involved in the financial statement preparation, as well as some of the process will lead to the preparation of the management reports. Okay, so identifying the next step, identifying risks in the processes. So most often, an organization prepares flowcharts or narratives of an important processes. This documentation focuses on specific risks and appropriate controls. So we need to identify the points within the company's processes where erroneous information could be processed that individually or in combination with other errors would produce misleading reports. Also, we identify the controls that management has implemented to prevent or timely detect and correct inaccurate information from being processed and reported. So when identifying ITGC risk, we can take a look at the controls which are preventive or detective. So ITGCs are designed to either prevent or detect and correct problems related to CIA or confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the IT processes. So just to refresh, preventive controls are controls that prevent misstatement due to error or fraud from being processed or recorded. Segregated duties are usually preventive controls. So example, employees must use non-name user IDs and strong passwords to log in to the company's system. So usually, pag magla-log in instead of let's say my name instead no RC Lazo, instead the company must use as a preventive control or a better alternative would be a non-name user ID. So minsan that would be my ID number. So let's say my ID number is 2021 1200. So this is our user ID, and there is a requirement for strong password. Next, detective and corrective controls. So these are controls that find misstatement due to error or fraud after they have been processed or recorded. In order to function properly, detective controls must be coupled with procedures to correct the misstatement. So for example, in relation to logging in, so unsuccessful login attempts are logged and investigated. So let's say si Arcilazo nag-try siya mag-login, tatlong beses na siya unsuccessful, tapos tumigil na siya, we must investigate bakit is it him also or is it him really trying to log in or is there another who got hold of his user ID and password trying to log in for himself. Okay. So next, identifying and testing ITGC risks. So ITGC testing focuses on the areas that are at the most risk to CIA of data and IT function. So of course, you do not need to test all the risks. So you would be needing to test all those that are relevant and poses a high risk or high impact. So IT risks are classified into three main categories. So parang parallel lang ng ating ITGC processes. So meron tatlo, ITGC access, IT program and system change risks, and IT operation risks. So risks in IT access, any unauthorized access to data, including data master files. So personnel with access beyond what is necessary. So it's important to know the segregation of duties breakdown. Next, inadequate user authentication and security settings, including password management and direct data changes made by IT personnel even with authorization. So kasi this is practically skipping the manage change process. So IT program and system change risk include reliance on faulty IT programs and systems and unauthorized changes to IT programs and systems. And IT operation risks is the failure to make requested changes to IT programs or systems, issues with IT programs that cannot process through to completion, are not addressed or are addressed incorrectly, including inappropriate manual intervention. And the third one, hardware or software issues result in the loss of data or the inability to accurately process data. So when identifying risk, we have to distinguish between whether it's really an ITGC or an application control. So management implements controls over how transactions that enter the company systems are initiated, authorized, processed, recorded, and reported. There are two groups of controls that relate to IT environment over this process. First one, ITGCs, which are controls that apply to the overall IT infrastructure and support services, and application controls, which are controls that relate to specific activities and applications. Input data is authorized, accurate, and complete. Data is processed timely, completely, accurately, and as intended. Data is completely and accurately stored and available as needed, and reports are complete and accurate. To properly designed and functioning ITGCs are critical to properly functioning application controls, and the integrity of the application controls rely to the integrity of ITGC for access, changes, and operation. So within ITGCs, application controls rely on the functioning of ITGC. And when ITGCs are not functioning, it will be hard to rely on the application controls. So application controls are performed in three ways. To operate effectively, any automated application control relies on functioning ITGC control. First, manual controls. These are controls that are performed by the people. So in the application or the application control, the credit manager approves credit application and establishes a credit limit. So the ITGC, there is none required unless the control relies on IT generated reports. So makikita natin, the credit manager approves the credit application and establishes credit limit. So it does not necessarily mean that this is an IT dependent manual control since they use the computer. So what matters is that this is still manually performed regardless of where it is performed. So the computer just seems to be a situs or a location where the control is performed. But this is still a control that are performed by people. Next, where ITGCs are necessary, automated controls are controls that are performed by an IT function. So an application, the billing process matches the invoice, sales orders, and GDN or goods delivered notes. So yung ITGC applicable to that is set on access, no unauthorized access to data, when someone could create or alter one of the documents, manage change. The billing process application has been tested for reliability and protected from changes, and operations. Documents are properly stored and accessible by approved applications. Okay, third, control, where ITGC is also necessary, are IT-dependent manual controls. So these are controls that are partially performed by a computer application but require user intervention to complete the control. So for example, our application, the sales application automatically produces sales orders for existing customers who don't exceed their credit limit. So the sales application generates an exception report and sales order are not created for customers order that exceeds the credit limits. So the credit manager follow-ups on the sales application. A generated report is followed up and resolves the exception. So from the sales, if that doesn't exceed the credit limit, So, meron ng sales order. Pag mag-exceed ng credit limit, merong exception report. So, sa ITGC, access is that no unauthorized access to the credit approval process. Change, the sales application has been tested for reliability and protected from changes. While operations, customer data is properly stored and only accessible by the approved applications. So automated controls are more reliable than manual controls. When applications, data, and supporting technology are protected from unauthorized access, changes, and operation risks, they operate the same way with reliability. So an automated control will continue to operate effectively if the ITGCs that have a direct impact are operating effectively. So manual controls are mostly subject to human errors and don't reliably perform control procedures the same way every time. So sample sizes for manual controls need to be much larger for than they do for automated controls due to the variability in control performance. So usually, only one instance of each attribute of an automated control for each possible path of interaction can take needs to be tested if ITGCs are effective over the last period. Next, we also perform. So the purpose of a walkthrough is to confirm the evaluator's understanding of the design and implementation of the ITGC. So the purpose of the work, yeah. First, an understanding of the design of various ITGC. For example, the evaluator would verify the understanding of the access approval process and policies with the systems admin and observe the system admin perform the control. Next, the design characteristics or attributes, including evidence that indicate the control function and was performed by the control owner. So example, the company hires a new AR clerk. The clerk needs access to the AR subledger to perform her job. A formal access request is sent to the system's admin, the control owner, and based on previously established and written AR job description, the system's admin verifies that the AR clerk needs access to the AR subledger to perform her job and grants and arranges for her to have logical access rights to AR subledger. System admin documents that the access requests have been granted. So it can also be used to know what constitutes a control exception. So example, an exception to the control not performing as designed would be this when the system admin or the control owner granting access to the AR subledger without going through the required steps or documenting the approval process. You can also perform walkthrough to verify the specific design attributes of the ITGCs that are present in the control. So for example, the Access ITGC process gives authority to the system's administrator, which is the control owner, to approve access rights for new users. The design attributes for the control would include, among other attributes, a description of the control owner, of what the control owner does to determine which rights the individual should have, including the basis for approval, the evidence produced or used to make such determination, and documentation that the approval was granted or denied. So once the walkthrough or other procedures including inquiry, are completed, we, we update our documentation as necessary and evaluate the effectiveness of the relevant ITGC as to whether the design of the control is in fact effective. These controls have been implemented and are operating, and the testing strategy and scope needs to be modified based on actual inquiry and observations. So now we design tests of ITGC. So first, the purpose to obtain appropriate evidence that ITGCs are operating effectively. And then, aware for changes throughout the period of testing. Be aware of any changes in the ITGCs that deviate from the understanding of controls gained at the time of the walkthrough. So for changes, to the extent that changes are identified, such as a change in the manner of which a control operates, breakdowns in controls identified by the entity or others, for example, internal audit, significant changes in IT personnel affecting controls or other duties. So let's obtain, or we need to obtain an understanding of the changes, update documentation consistent with the changes, confirm their understanding of the changes and other procedures by inquiry of control owners, and determine if changes are needed to the testing procedure and strategies. For example, if there is a change in the control owner, evaluate that this new control is competent and objective. Now, our testing procedure would include, so there's a variety of testing procedures ranging from, we can review policies and procedure, test access control, review procedures and outcomes for testing program or configuration changes, and performing backup and recovery procedures and testing. So there is a handout. Please check it in the LMS for more samples. So what are the implications of ITGCs for management? So the risks of using IT. So the use of IT in business provides many benefits, including efficiencies and the opportunity for an environment with strong oversight and internal controls. Strong ITGCs address the risks that come with the use of IT. So hindi tayo parang what they say as bara-bara lang. Or parang, let's say, gusto nyo mag-SAP, sige mag-SAP tayo. And then, bahala na kung paano gagawin sa user access, etc. So the typical risks addressed by ITGCs are reliance by management on IT systems and programs are not accurately processing transactions or data, or are processing inaccurate transactions or data, or both. Unauthorized access to data exists, which could result in the destruction of data or improper changes to data, for example, via error or fraud, as well as recording unauthorized or non-existent transactions, for example, fraud, or inaccurate recording of transactions. ITGC risks. So without appropriate ITGCs, risk increase in areas such as breakdown of segregation of duties, such as IT personnel gaining access privileges beyond those needed in their role. Unauthorized changes, error or intentional fraud to data in the master files or systems and programs. Inappropriate manual intervention, failure to make needed changes to systems or programs timely or at all, and potential permanent loss of internal data, important data, or the inability to access data timely. So potential business risks. A company faces increased business risks if ITGCs are ineffective because the information and reports generated by the IT systems that management relies on to make decisions may be incorrect. Incorrect and incomplete information may be supplied to external parties such as regulatory agencies, lenders, and investors. And from a business operations and management standpoint, errant financial or managerial data or the lack of confidence in the data and reporting can be highly detrimental to management's ability to effectively operate and manage the business. And lastly, what are the examples of business risk of ineffective ITGC? So examples of negative effects on an entity with ineffective ITGC include inaccurate or untimely internal financial information can cause cash flow problems, such as a lack of accurate or timely billing of customers or inability to purchase needed goods. So for example, if there are problems in producing the SOA or billing statements, then you won't be able to collect on time. So a higher risk of fraud both from inside the entity and from external parties or cybersecurity risk. So a publicly traded company cannot generate a timely, accurate financial reporting, and it may not be able to timely file its required periodic reports with the SEC. Among other negative effects, not only could this result in a debt covenant violation, being a non-timely filer typically disallows an entity from raising capital in public markets. And the value of entity stock may decline due to concerns about the entity in the market. Though such value declines are sometimes temporary, they often trigger class action lawsuits against the entity and management. Also, debt agreements may require that entity establish and maintain effective internal controls, for example, receive a clean, not adverse, internal control over financial reporting opinion from its external auditor. And the lack of doing so could fail a debt covenant, triggering conditions such as penalty interest rates or the acceleration of debt principal, which could have dire consequences on an entity's ability to continue as a going concern. Okay, so that's it for part three, evaluating ITGC. So let's move on to the last part. Okay, the next part or the last part is part four, audit response to the ineffective ITGC. So the module outline importance of effective ITGC, ineffective ITGC implications for the audit, ineffective ITGC's implication for the audit opinion on the internal control over financial reporting, or the ICFR. So virtually all entities heavily rely on their IT environment to process and record financial transactions and related data, which are the main sources of internal and external financial reporting. Consequently, the appropriate functioning of ITGCs, which serve as the foundation for all IT application, is crucial. So if ITGCs are ineffective, both entity management and the auditor can face difficult challenge determining if the financial amounts generated by the IT systems are correct. The auditor will need to perform substantially more substantive work in order to reach a conclusion over the financial statements and disclosure. So the auditor may also render an adverse opinion on ICFR. So ICFR is usually done on what we call ICAO or SOX 44 404 audits. So US companies lang to are registered in the US. So it is generally poorly received by entities, shareholders, other stakeholders, and interested parties such as potential investors, external financial analysts, customers, trade creditors, and lenders. And from a business operations and management standpoint, errant financial data or the lack of confidence in financial data and reporting can be highly detrimental to the management's ability to effectively operate and manage the business, which is concerning to auditors. Ineffective ITGCs will also affect the nature, timing, and extent of substantive audit and control procedures that the auditor performs to address the risks. For example, the what can go wrongs that financial statement amounts or disclosures are materially misstated. If the risk, for example, managed changes, is not effectively addressed by the ITGCs, then the auditor must determine how particular significant classes of transaction or scots, for example, sales process, are affected. In this example, and in this example, reports and processing logic and reporting sales, perhaps regarding pricing, discount, or credit authorization, cannot be relied upon. So the nature of testing changes from the mix of control, so reliance approach and substantive procedure to a substantive approach. So test of details. So instead na mag-rely lang sa controls after control testing and then do minimal substantive testing, we are we need to do more test of details. So, for example, without effective managed change control, the auditor cannot take the approach of testing the control over changes in general as well as testing changes made to the sales cuts because there is no assurance that, among other potential errors, all changes to the related IT application that should have been made were in fact made, or if they were made, that they were correctly made and sufficiently reviewed. The response would be to take a substantive approach and not rely on the controls to provide audit evidence. Timing. So the timing of substantive tests will be performed as of or very near year end. Whereas had the ITGCs been effective, the auditor may have performed substantive testing at an interim date and used update procedures to bring the procedures forward to year end. In practice, control testing is typically performed through an interim date with some form of update procedure to provide assurance of the continued functioning of the controls through the full year. For a calendar year entity, the testing of ITGCs might be conducted from January 1 through an interim date of September 30. So, for example, the audit team tested ITGC during September but found deficiencies. Because of ITGC weaknesses, the risk of material misstatement is increased. Consequently, the audit team must perform substantive procedures at year-end in order to provide reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatements. The extent of testing will increase, meaning that among other testing, the testing of details, such as the number of sales transactions and the number of accounts receivable confirmations sent by the auditor, will be greater than if the ITGCs had been effective. So, for example, the audit team planned to obtain audit evidence from internal control testing. However, because of ITGC deficiencies, the team will need to increase the amount of evidence it obtains from substantive tests of details in order to provide reasonable assurance that financial statements are free from material misstatement. So, implications for the audit opinion on ICFR. So in situations when the auditor is unable to conclude that there are effective ITGCs, there are implications on the auditor's opinion. So for example, in the financial statement audit opinion, when there are ineffective ITGCs, the auditor can generally design and perform incremental substantive and control procedures other than on ITGCs and affected controls sufficient to enable them to render an unqualified opinion on the financial statements. Often, however, these incremental procedures are extensive because of the lack of controls heightens the audit risk considerably. And on the ICFR opinion, if the ITGCs are ineffective for one or more of the IT processes, the auditor will need to determine if the deficiency is a sign of significant deficiency or a material weakness in internal controls. One or more material weakness requires the auditor to issue an adverse audit opinion on the ICFR. So in practice, since the ICFR opinion is as of the year-end date, ineffective controls that are discovered prior to the year-end period can be remediated by the entity and then retested by the auditor. If the auditors are able to satisfy themselves through testing that controls as remediated are effectively designed and operating as of year-end, then from an ICFR standpoint, the auditor may be able to conclude that the control functioned effectively as of year end. Ultimately, if one or more ITGC is determined to be ineffective as of year end and the auditor concludes that the effect of the financial statements could fail to prevent and detect and correct a material misstatement from error or fraud in the financial statements, the auditor would conclude that there was a material weakness in ICFR. A material weakness conclusion would result in the auditor's ICFR opinion stating that the entity did not maintain effective internal controls, referred to as an adverse opinion on the ICFR. A lesser severity conclusion, likely a significant deficiency, does not prevent the auditor from issuing a clean or unqualified ICFR opinion. So note on the word could above, the assessment of severity of the ineffective controls on ICFR not only considers errors and frauds that actually occurred during the audit period, but the auditor must also make a judgment as to the severity or materiality of the errors and fraud that theoretically would escape timely prevention or detection and correction because the controls were ineffective. This often is a complex and highly judgmental evaluation by the auditor. And that concludes our discussion for internal controls ITGC.